on our visit, I would like maybe just to briefly to say three things because I would like actually it to be more really this dialogue between each other rather than me lecturing. But I mean the first thing what really touched me was when Marcia started by talking about the oppression of the Native American that started 500 years ago. Because this is not something to be taken for granted. When somebody from an oppressed community really talks about the oppression of another community. And she started with that, not with her own. I thought that was really very powerful. And then she spoke about the 400-year enslavement of the African American people. And actually, if making the connection to Palestine, and I keep saying that the oppression in Palestine has like three dimensions. Somehow Israel imported three oppressive systems, and they are like the unholy trinity, three in one. So from East Germany, they imported the walls. And so our cities are surrounded by 25-foot high wall. That is the case in Bethlehem, surrounded from three sides by this wall. And what we have inside the wall is less than 12 square miles, basically, where we can move freely. But then they imported the idea of apartheid from South Africa. It was actually the former Prime Minister of Israel, Sharon, who went to South Africa to learn how the whites there are able to keep the black controlled. And he imported this idea of the grid. Basically, you build settlements in vertically two different sets of settlements vertically, and three sets of settlements horizontally. You get a grid, and then that makes sure that Palestinians cannot actually move freely, and they will never have their own state. And the third thing they imported actually is reservation, the idea of reservations from North America. So you take the land of the native people, and if you cannot get rid of them, I mean, the first option is always to get rid of them. Now this functioned in 1948, when Israel was able to displace 800,000 people, who today are refugees all over the world. 67, it didn't work. I remember my father when Israel occupied Bethlehem in 67, and my mother was urging him to leave home and to go to the church of the Nativity, which is literally across the street, 12 foot away. He said, no, I would rather die in my home rather than leave it, because we don't want to repeat the story of 1948. And so he stayed in his house. So it didn't work for Israel. And so today we have 6.5 million Palestinians and 6.5 million Jews sharing the same land, but with totally different access to land and different access to resources and freedom, etc. So you have these three in one. Walls, apartheid, and reservation, that all were put together actually to slowly replace our people, because that is, and I was saying yesterday, if you want one word to discuss, to talk about our situation, it's settler colonialism. And settler colonialism actually means you go there to replace the people, not to live with them, and not to leave, but to replace them. So that's the, and so these three methods are used. And so the connection to the Native American and to the African American in this country is really important. And this is why I really very much appreciated how you started over lunch, acknowledging where you are standing and talking about the creek, also with the native name of the creek, because that is very important. And the other connection is to the African American community is, when you confine people in areas with no resources, and you take the prime land and you put them in areas where actually there are no resources, then people live in strangled neighborhoods. And Bethlehem is a strangled city, which really means a strangled city. I mean, you will have high unemployment. Then with time, you have no services. And then you wonder that there will be social problems, crime, drugs. I mean, all of these are not because these people are violent, but because the oppressive system that put them there with no resources. I mean, this was a man-planned catastrophe. It's not a natural catastrophe, but it's really a man-planned. And so when I look today at African American neighborhoods, I can't see what might happen in Bethlehem 20, 30 years down the road. Because this is like a blueprint of this kind of oppression. Having said that, let me move to the second point, so not to leave you depressed. I mean, the resilience of people is amazing. Mm-hmm. I mean, imagine 500 years of oppression, taking everything, and yet these people are still there fighting. And the interesting thing is, and I have a few friends from the Native American community here, the importance of art in their fight, the importance of dance in keeping their identity, and this idea of using art actually as a mean of creative resistance. And after 500 years, they still did not give up. And the same story actually with the African American. After 400 years, they are still fighting. They did not reach, and I think today Marsha said, we have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. So after 400 years, they haven't yet reached the goal, and yet they continue. And what sustained them in all of these years was art. In this case, gospel song. That was actually the tool they used, not only to survive, but to thrive in spite of everything. And for me, this is where I make the connection to our university, how important actually this focus on arts and culture, that to keep the resilience of people, but also to nurture the identity of a nation. And the third thing, which when I think of George Floyd now in particular, uh, what young African American young people have to go through. I shared yesterday, I was in Washington, met there, was in a meeting with an African American bishop, and he was sharing that when his son drive the car, and he was telling his son, if the police stop you, don't move your hand, don't open the door because you never know. And I could sense the anxiety of the father, which is maybe nothing compared with the anxiety of the young man himself. And this is what our young people actually are going through on a daily basis. As a president of a university where we deal with young people, every day now, I mean, I'm not exaggerating, every day Israel lynched one Palestinian young man on the street, on a checkpoint. And all these police people have impunity. Nobody takes them to court. Some of them got even promoted. I mean, imagine. And so, that breaks my heart. And I see how actually in the last few months, our students are traumatized by what they see every day. And many of them, what they do every day is just to go to another funeral of another young man who was lynched, who was killed. So, in fact, the same week George Floyd was killed, another Palestinian was killed in East Jerusalem in a similar way. And it's what is scary is that the police here in Minneapolis, they got their training by Israeli police.
Right.
It's the worst group of people you want to train your people. And so there is a connection between what happened to George Floyd and what is happening every day in Palestine. But let me end again with one last. I was really moved by what the churches here are doing. I mean, this church, Trinity. You were just sharing a bit with me. I would like to hear more from you. Westminster. This doing ministry in you, and I think what's her name? The one who guided us. Sherry. Yeah. Sherry, I think used the word. She said radical. I think she said we are radical, and I mean, this witness of the church here, this emphasis on social justice in this context, walking the talk. For me was very impressive and gave me the impression that the church is alive, the church is doing ministry in this very complex situation, and the church is trying, and it's not the whole church, I know in the US, but you are really doing amazing work in changing the situation and in walking the talk that we always preach about. So thank you for that. I talk maybe more than what Carla wanted.